There's Dogecoin, there's Shiba Inu coin, but when are we gonna get vicious werewolf coin? I want some crypto that can truly tear me apart, rather than my portfolio. Today I've got some allegedly true and new, at least to me, stories about encounters with werewolves. So lower the blinds and block out the moon while you enjoy these stories. I want to narrate your stories in a future episode, so send them to me at darkstories.org or eeriecast.com/forum. I want to hear more stories about monsters in the mountains soon. Also, I need a favor, please. The end of the year is coming up, and I need you to link me in the comments to your absolute favorite story I've told in 2021. Please don't link me to stories I didn't tell or stories I told in previous years. I'll be trying to put together a compilation of the best stories of 2021 before the new year. One more thing, go to Apple Podcasts or iTunes, look up Redwood Bureau under Podcasts, listen to the first episode, and leave an honest review for it. Thanks. Now, let's begin. Werewolf on the Old Road, Encounter Part 1, from Camper. At 18 years old, I moved away to the city for college. I lived on campus, which was required by the university at the time. Fine by me. My roommate, Caleb, and I quickly became friends, after discovering we shared the same interests and hobbies, especially smoking up. We weren't allowed to smoke the devil's lettuce on campus, so we'd often take nighttime rides in his old Nissan. We'd always go down these old back roads several miles away from campus. There was an area in these back roads where there was just one streetlight on the road. It had an eerie orange glow, and it was the only streetlight we'd found on those roads, as if it was the only one that had been installed and was soon forgotten. Kinda creepy, yeah, but it made for a fantastic spot to just chill and smoke. Caleb and I would sit there for hours, going back and forth with childhood stories or work stories, the latter of which I didn't have many of, because I'd only ever had one job, the one I currently worked at, which was Starbucks. I remember the first encounter all too clearly. "Dude, what was the craziest order you've ever gotten at Starbucks?" Caleb asked me, as he began to take another toke. "Bro, I've only been there for about 3 months now," I replied, shaking my head with a smile. Come on, you've had to have had an annoying order so far, right? At least one," he insisted. I thought for a moment, my mind going a quarter of the speed it should have been, when finally something came to mind. Well, there was this one drive-thru order where a guy ordered just 2 shots of espresso and 8 times whipped cream. Caleb held in the smoke and looked at me with the biggest WTF face he could muster. "What's even the point of that?" he managed to say. I don't really know. Better yet, when the guy pulled through, he wasn't wearing anything but boxers. Caleb exhaled and cleared his throat. "Now that's something I can agree with. I hate pants, man. Annoying to take off and annoying to put on." He handed me the cig, and I nodded as if to say here, here in agreement, when something happened that startled us. I nearly dropped the cig in the floor. Something rubbed up against the car. Something big enough to make it shake back and forth. I remember gripping with my free hand the seat, then looking over at Caleb with wide eyes. We didn't say anything for a moment. We kinda just waited there, seeing what was gonna happen. Then we began to scan the side and rearview mirrors. On my side of the car, the passenger side, I saw this large, hairy black shape. It was rubbing its body roughly against the rear fender well, or whatever you call that part of the car right above the wheel, the edge of that opening. This creature was definitely huge, easily the size of one of us, and obviously strong enough to push the car side to side. It reminded me of the videos I've seen online, of bears rubbing themselves against things to scratch their itchy spots. That's what I assumed it was. "Caleb, dude, there is a black bear over here scratching his hip on the car," I said to my friend next to me. "Quit joking, dude, what the heck is that?" I leaned over closer to the side view mirror, without letting the window down, of course. "I'm telling you, Caleb, it's a freaking black bear." Caleb slowly raised himself from his seat to get a better angle. "Holy crap, dude. This is the closest I've ever been to a bear," Caleb admitted. Do you think we should drive away?" I asked him. I don't know. Maybe we should just wait it out. I mean, we don't have any food. I don't think he wants in here. I think he's just itchy." So the two of us watched and waited for this black hairy creature to finish scratching himself. But you know how animals sometimes do normal things extra long? You ever watch a cat sneeze and he sneezes for like 5 minutes? Or watch a dog scratch himself with his teeth for like 20 minutes straight? Well, that's kind of the situation we got ourselves in. The supposed bear kept scratching himself on the car for the next 12 minutes. All the while, the two of us were too afraid to move, thinking we would alert our guest. In reality, a bear would have been scared and would just run away if he heard us. But in our high and scared minds, we were seriously thinking the bear would attack us and try to get in the car. Anyway, after those long 12 minutes, something even more confusing and astonishing happened. The creature rose up on 2 legs. Yeah, everyone knows bears stand up on 2 legs too. The difference here was the shape of the thing after it stood up. This thing was slender, with lots of juts and angles to its body. Its torso was only about 1/3 the length of its legs, and its legs were backwards bending. At least I think they were. They were long and seemingly muscular, which was obvious even through that thick black fur that covered it. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think bear legs get that long. I looked up at the head, which was about 7 feet in the air at this point at full height, well above the car's height, but still just low enough that I could see it through my window. What I saw were pointed ears and dark eyes. In fact, I could only see the eyes because they reflected the orange light of the streetlight. Whatever this thing was, it raised up its right arm or leg? I'm not sure what it would be called. It wasn't actively using it to stand, but it raised up its right upper limb and began to gnaw at the elbow region, an action that reminded me completely of my old dog scratching his leg. Think about how a dog scratches their body by rapidly chomping their teeth on the spot with little bitty bites. That's what this thing was doing. In everything except its body's shape, it reminded me of a dog or a canine. There was definitely a snout, and ears that seemed perky and pointed. I didn't look over at Caleb, but I could tell from his silence that he had seen this thing stand up too. I don't remember either of us even breathing as we watched. In one quick motion, the creature slapped its other arm onto the surface of the top of the car, apparently using it to balance and lean himself on the car. The movement from its rapid scratching traveled through its body and into the claw that was on top of the car now, causing the most irritating, ear-rattling metallic sound that was akin to but worse than nails on a chalkboard. The moment we heard it, we both shot our hands up to our ears, covering them. But Caleb made a terrifying mistake. When he covered his ears, he instinctively muttered a curse word in annoyance. When he realized he'd said anything, his eyes shot wide open. I watched in horror as his face turned, not to me, but to the passenger window right next to me. And at the same time that happened, the sound of the scratching on the roof and the gnawing of the creature's arm both stopped. Something told me I already knew what he was looking at through my window. I stared into Caleb's eyes, and I began to turn, still staring into them. But Caleb rapidly shook his head, as if to tell me, do not turn around, do not look out your window. I've never felt so scared in my life. Do I listen to my friend? Or do I witness what that thing truly is? Do I see this creature that I'd never seen or heard of before, up close? Well, curiosity is a heck of a thing. I took my eyes off of Caleb, and I turned my head more slowly than I ever had before. My heart stopped when I saw it. The thing outside was bent down, allowing its face and head to be level with the passenger window. Its face was nearly pressed up to the glass, and it was staring right at me. There was something chilling at the thought that this thing had been staring into the back of my head before I'd turned. It never looked at Caleb, who had made the sound. Instead, it was transfixed on me. Then I realized, because I'd turned to see it, it had seen me move. Therefore, it had no doubt that there were things in this car that had been watching it. At the current angle of this creature, the streetlight's glow could no longer reach it, which made its dark eyes look more like black holes in its furry face. We stared at one another for a long time, until eventually it sniffed at the glass, seemed satisfied, and began to walk away with long strides across the road. This road was about 9.5 feet wide, and I swear I remember this thing crossing the road in just 2 steps. As it walked away, the long claws at the end of its arms swayed back and forth, the way a person's hands move as they walk, swinging in the opposite direction of the adjacent leg. It was amazing how inhuman this thing looked, yet when it moved, it looked human. If this thing passed by you in the woods from a distance, you'd probably just think it was a hunter or a hiker, another person. But when you get up close, you see how tall and hairy and angular it is. The moment it broke through the tree line, I hadn't said a word, but Caleb launched himself at the steering wheel and planted his foot on the accelerator. He ripped tread out of there, flying down the road, away from the streetlight, until the only light on the car and the road was the moon. And no, it wasn't a full moon. I remember checking it myself. It was a crescent moon that night. Caleb and I sped back to the campus. We went to our dorm, locked ourselves in our room, and stayed up all night, debating and discussing what this thing was, or if it was even real. It was unlike anything we'd ever seen before. This one incident gave me nightmares for weeks to come. But to Caleb, it inspired him to want to explore those back roads even more, and somehow I let him talk me into it. Werewolf on the Old Road, Encounter Part 2, from Camper. A few months after the first incident, I'd finally gathered the courage to go back. Then again, it may not have been courage, but peer pressure, as Caleb was relentless, constantly asking, "Dude, would you go back with me, please? We have to see that thing again." And despite explaining to him that I've had nightmares since then, he just kept pushing and pushing. I eventually gave in. Caleb was my only friend, and part of me was worried that he would go alone, and there was no telling what a creature that shape and size would do to a man. So we started going back and smoking at that same spot under the one streetlight. A week, a month, a year passed by. There were no more strange encounters during that period. At that point, Caleb had given up hope of seeing it again, chalking it up to some freak encounter or shared hallucination. As for me, I believed it really did happen, and I didn't believe in shared hallucinations. The next encounter would not happen until about 2.5 years later. We were driving through the back roads in Caleb's car again. We weren't at that section with the one streetlight this time. It was a new moon night as well, so the only reliable source of light to see where we were going were the headlights. And Caleb, cheaping out and risking a ticket, had failed to replace his left headlight, which had gone out a month prior. So it was really difficult to see as we went along those bends and curves, with only one bright light to guide the way. Because of that, Caleb almost didn't see it step into the middle of the road, right in front of us. I remember Caleb scream a curse as he slammed on the brakes. Thankfully I was buckled up, or I might have ended up flying through the windshield, landing on the road right next to this thing. When we came to a full stop, at first I could only see one leg, but as I focused more, I could see its entire outline, a familiar, dreadful outline. I don't know if it was the same creature or another one of the same species, but it was certainly the same type of thing we saw those years ago, and once again, it was staring at us. This time, it seemed upset, as if it knew we almost hit it, and because of that, it did something new, something worse. Its lips began to curl up, revealing sharp teeth that reminded me of a canine's. There was something creepy about the way only one half of its face was lit by the headlight, only one half of its teeth reflecting the light from the car. "Caleb," I whispered, "you need to keep going." "You want me to hit the thing?" he said a little too loud. No. You need to go around the thing. We need to get home. Now." He nodded. We looked back at this creature. Just before Caleb lifted off the brake, the strange beast in front of us took off, disappearing into the dark half of the road. But I knew it hadn't left, because I could still hear its frantic, heavy footsteps on the left side of the car, the dark half of the road that we could not see. "Caleb," I tried to get his attention. "Step on the gas." He wasn't listening, though. He seemed panicked, his eyes quickly scanning back and forth randomly in the dark part of the road. Knowing how Caleb was, he probably wanted to locate it before flooring it. No, he wasn't afraid of hitting the creature. More like he was too insecure to take off, too scared, not knowing where the creature was. Caleb was weird like that. He would have been the kind of kid that knew the boogeyman was in his room, but wanted to see where it was first, before screaming or running to his parents. But something inside me told me that that kind of reaction was going to get us killed. Turns out my instincts might have been right, because suddenly, those footsteps outside stopped. We waited in silence, listening for the thing, and I broke the silence, continuing to beg Caleb to just take off and get us back home. After all, he'd been the one that wanted to come back out here in the first place. He was the one that seemed obsessed with seeing the creature again, and yet he seemed more terrified than I was. Then the unthinkable happened. The handle to the back door lifted, and the door began to open. "Caleb!" I called out to him, jerking my head in the direction of the back seat, horrified at the idea of that thing crawling into the car with us. Thankfully, finally, Caleb listened. He woke out of his stupor, and he hammered on the gas, lurching the vehicle forward so hard the back door slammed shut. But you better believe I was scanning the back seat, making sure nothing got in with us. Luckily, there was nothing there in the seats, and there was only fast food bags in the floor. I thought it was over, but I was dead wrong. Caleb sped as fast as he could go, which wasn't fast enough, as he had to be careful with the bends and turns with only one headlight. The next time I turned toward him, I saw something out his window, a reflection off two beady black eyes from the lights on the car stereo. That beast was giving chase to us, and it was somehow keeping up with us. It was running on all fours just outside of Caleb's door, and it was staring into the window. Caleb, I tried to say, but Caleb interrupted me. "I see it, camper. Out of the corner of my eye, I can see it right there." Without warning, he turned sharply to the left. Suddenly, there was a bump and another bump as something tumbled and rolled underneath the car's wheels, and at the same time, that creature's eyes disappeared from the side of the car. Caleb had ran the darn thing over, and the mad lad didn't stop to check if it was gone or dead. He kept going, driving down the road until we saw the lights of the city. When we made it back to campus, we ran like bats out of heck back to the dorms. I had this creepy thought that that thing could keep up with the car, so if it had survived being run over, and it decided to continue following us, then it could have been out there waiting for us to leave the car. But luckily, that was just fear talking. We made it back inside okay. This time, back in the dorm, we looked at each other and just laughed. I couldn't believe what we'd just experienced. "Dude, you freaking ran it over," I said to Caleb. "I know. That's all I could think of to do at the moment. If I'd gone any faster, we'd have ended up on the side of the road or in a tree," he explained. Well, it was good and quick thinking, man, because this time that thing looked real mad. I sighed, feeling exhausted all of a sudden. What do you think it was, camper?" Caleb asked. This was the same question we'd asked each other before, after the first incident. I'd always said before, "I don't know," because I really didn't have an answer. And I was just about to say the same thing again, that I don't have any clue. But before I could answer, Caleb said, "Werewolves can't really exist, right? That thing looked exactly like some sort of rendition of a werewolf. I looked at Caleb for a moment. He was sincere. I looked down, thinking. I wanted to say he was right. I mean, it did look like a werewolf. But they're the stuff of fiction, right? Magical, mythological creatures like that don't exist. I mean, they can't exist. But there we were, having narrowly escaped an animal that looked exactly like one. "Whatever it was, Caleb," I said. "It was real. I'm for sure this time that was real." He nodded rapidly in agreement and excitement and also a bit of fear. That's how I felt too. It was exhilarating. Something about escaping something dangerous felt exciting, but also terrifying. After that incident, we never did see it again, likely because we never wanted to see it again. After that, Caleb was well enough secure to not see it up close anymore. Instead, he kept his obsession online, looking into stories and sightings of creatures like the werewolf. He got real into the Dogman, the Beast of Bray Road and all that. I took a different approach. I didn't want to have anything else to do with it, and I wanted to forget about it, move on, keep my story to myself. Unfortunately, the human mind has a special way of dealing with things that scar you for life. It keeps them fresh in your mind, makes sure they're especially clear in your memory. So I've never forgotten about this, and at this point, the only way I can feel relief about it is sharing it with people. In person, folks usually don't believe. Occasionally, you meet someone who's very excited and open to believing you, and it makes me feel a little less crazy. To anyone else out there who's seen a dogman or a werewolf, know that you're not alone. There are strange things out there, things that aren't supposed to exist. We switched rooms. From Bard of the Hall. This happened about 15 years ago, when I was 7 years old and my brother Brandon was 5. Brandon had never been scared of the dark. He wasn't frightened by scary movies. I'd tried and failed 1,000 times to even startle him by waiting around a corner and jumping out as he walked past. He'd even laugh when I did it. Brandon was strange in that he just didn't seem scared. We moved out of town to the country earlier that year. Dad bought us a nice, cozy house out in the rolling hills of the Midwest. He'd managed to make a living trading stocks through a combination of business phone calls, the internet, and occasional trips back into the city. This career of his was something that confused me terribly at that age, but I was happy we could move into a much bigger and more open place. Brandon and I loved the outdoors. In the fall, when the grass went from green to yellow and got all crunchy, I loved rolling down the hills on my side, feeling the stalks of grass break underneath me. However, Mom didn't like the part where I'd come back inside covered in dead grass. Brandon was fond of climbing trees, yet another thing he was braver about doing than me. I had a fear of falling if I attempted to climb something too tall, so I'd just watch and make sure he didn't fall himself. Those first several months at the new house were picturesque. Then came winter, when everything changed. When winter rolled around, my brother Brandon began to act strange and different. He'd wake up in the mornings tired, whereas he'd usually be wide awake with a pep in his step. I noticed he made a point of staying closer to the house. Our adventures to the tree line to watch him climb trees suddenly stopped. I figured he didn't like climbing anymore. Most of all, I noticed he dreaded going to bed, and he grew to have a fear of the dark or of night. At the time, I couldn't tell which for sure. There was something heartbreaking watching my brother, who was always so brave and active and happy, suddenly change to such a reserved and quiet person. The boy that loved adventure suddenly feared it. Winter went on, and I witnessed his condition worsen. My mom and dad were growing concerned, trying to change his diet, thinking maybe he wasn't getting enough vitamin D or calcium or something. Trips to the doctor and blood tests revealed that he was perfectly fine, at least physically. So something was going on in my brother's head. I'd ask him time and time again, "Brandon, what's wrong? Don't you want to climb trees?" And he'd just shake his head. I remember asking, "Are you scared of something?" He nodded his head. "Well, what is it?" But then he'd shake his head and say, "Nothing." During this period, I asked my mom and dad if Brandon and I could switch rooms. This was my idea, one that I'd had for a while because I didn't really like the location of my room. It was further away from the bathroom he and I shared, and I had a more active bladder than him. Plus, out my window, there wasn't really much to look at, except for a big empty field and clouds. I know a lot of people would like that, but if I had the choice, I'd rather stare out to the woods, which is what Brandon's room faced. My mom said, "Sure, but only if you and your brother agree on it, okay?" Excited, I nodded my head, and I ran over to Brandon, who was watching TV on the couch. "Hey, Mom said we could trade rooms. Do you want to? Maybe at least try it for a while?" His expression went from one of boredom to one of concern, even surprise. He shook his head and then stopped, as if to think, then began to nod his head slowly. Yeah, that's okay," he told me. "Great." I ran over and told Mom, who looked back at Brandon on the couch. "All right then, you guys can switch rooms, but don't go moving any big furniture, okay? You can swap sheets and blankets, just don't swap the whole bed." "All right," I told her. Then I grabbed Brandon and we went to our rooms together, swapping some smaller things out. But for some reason the whole time, Brandon appeared sad, as if he regretted his choice. I asked him several times, "You sure you want to switch?" But he remained adamant that he did. In fact, later that night I was certain that he was happy with the change, because he went to bed early, almost excited to go to sleep in his new room. After a couple of hours playing with cars and army men, Mom and Dad told me it was time for bed too. So I went off down the hall, first peering quietly into Brandon's new room, or my old room. He was sleeping in the bed, snoring even. It made me happy to see him getting some good sleep. Maybe he'd be a bit more normal in the morning. Feeling good that I made the switch with him, I went off to his room, my new room. I turned on the nightlight, then crawled under my covers. I turned over on my left side and kinda just stared out the window, getting a feel of my new view. At the time, the windows in my room and Brandon's room didn't have curtains or blinds. Mom tried to put curtains and blinds on our windows, but I remember stopping her and saying, "I want to see outside." When she reminded me I can just open the curtains and blinds, I stood firm and said, "No, I want to see them always." And being my little brother, Brandon agreed, saying that how I do it is how he wants to do it. So, no blinds or curtains in the boys' rooms. That night, there was enough moonlight outside that the nearby tree line wasn't just dark. I could see trees and branches swaying in the wind. I just stared out at the nighttime foliage until I dozed off for a while. I remember waking up on my back in the bed. It was still the middle of the night. One of my parents came in my room and must have turned off my nightlight, because at the time it was off. They often did that, to save on the electric bill. Luckily, I hadn't awakened in complete darkness because, as I said, the light from outside was just bright enough that I could make things out in my room and outside. So I turned back over on my left side, my favorite position to sleep in, and I was just about to close my eyes when I gazed out the window again. There was something more than just tree line outside, because there was something standing at the window, peering in. It was so bewildering and startling that I couldn't breathe. My eyes went wide, my mouth too, and I looked at it, and it looked back at me. It was like a dog, except especially tall, with its front two paws on the glass, paws that looked awfully like hands with nails that looked like claws. I saw dark gray fur covering it, a long snout ending in a shiny black nose. It stared at me for several seconds before beginning to move. I watched its paw hands move towards the edges of the windowsill, tracing them as if feeling for something. Then, at the bottom, its hands stopped, and it tugged upward harshly. I heard the window shake, and I realized, in sheer terror, it was trying to open my window. Even though I wanted to, I didn't scream. Even though I wanted to jump up and run to my parents' room, I couldn't. I could only lie there, paralyzed, watching this thing trying to open a window. It fiddled with the window from the outside for several minutes, and to my relief, it just gave up at a certain point. With an audible huff, it turned and walked away. Adding to my horror, I could hear its heavy footsteps as it walked, one leg at a time like a person. Heavy thuds that made it sound like it was much heavier than my dad. Eventually, when the creature was gone and I could no longer hear its footsteps, I shot right out of my bed and I ran to Brandon's room. I tried to be quiet, but I was panicking. I opened his door and crawled in bed next to him. Once under his blanket, I turned towards him and was surprised to see that he was wide awake, eyes full of tears. Before I could say a word, Brandon said to me over and over, "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." I was confused. I didn't understand for a moment, but then I realized why he was apologizing. The reason for his sudden change, his sudden fear of things. Brandon had been visited by this creature at his window since winter started. I understood now he felt guilty. He at first didn't want me to go to his room, but the idea of getting better sleep and not having to be terrified must have gotten to him. I didn't blame him one bit. I knew he wasn't trying to get me hurt. Right away, I looked him in the eyes and said, "It's okay, it's okay. Why didn't you tell me?" And all he could say as he cried was, "I was scared." Morning arrived without any further events, but now my brother and I were in on this together, and we had to do something to make this stop. I knew they wouldn't believe us if we simply told them what we saw. They would chalk it up to a nightmare, even though Brandon and I had both seen the same thing. If not a nightmare, it would just be kids being kids to them. However, I had a plan. You see, my dad absolutely hated spiders. That following night, before my mom and dad went to bed, I found the biggest spiders I could find, kept them in jars throughout the day, and when the time came that night, I put them in my mom and dad's bed. Don't worry, they weren't the dangerous kind to people. I made sure one of them was on my dad, and I prodded him to make him wake up and see it. He screamed, and I have no idea how I managed to escape the room without him realizing I'd done it. After my dad dealt with the spiders in the bed, he told my mom he was not sleeping in there that night. He grabbed a blanket and moved on to the couch. I felt pretty bad about it, but this brought me to part 2 of my plan, which, yeah, it was just another spider. I waited about 10 or 15 minutes to make sure he was sleeping. Then I placed the last one I had right on his face. Just as I was about to prod him, the tickling of the spider's legs was already waking him up. I ran to my room and I waited. Then, right on cue, he screamed again. That poor spider probably became a sacrifice, but a necessary one to make sure my brother and I could get out of this situation. Before long, Dad was coming down the hallway towards my room. He opened the door, checked to see if I was awake, then sat on the bed because I was pretending to be sleeping. He jostled my shoulder, and when I opened my eyes towards him, he said, "Hey, little guy, you want to go sleep with your brother and I'll sleep in here?" He didn't even try to explain anything, but I just nodded and walked towards Brandon's room. As I said before, Brandon's room is closer to the bathroom, closer to the rest of the house, meaning it would be the first of the kids' rooms my dad would stop at. Not to mention, he was the one I inherited my extra active bladder from, so this room would be his first choice. I walked on down the hall to Brandon's room, who was awake and waiting on me. I walked in excited and smiling, and said, "It worked." We crawled under the covers, and we waited. We must have fallen asleep waiting. When we woke up, it was because my mom and dad were quietly picking us up and carrying us in their arms to the car. Tired and groggy, I looked around. They were walking fast, and when we got to the car, there was a bunch of bags packed in the back. Dad had his gun and holster on, and when he got us in the car and began to drive away from the house, I remember him calling someone. Now I understand, I think he was calling the Forest Service, Animal Control, or the cops, or maybe all of them one at a time. I can't be sure, because I fell back to sleep with Brandon in the car. We woke up later at a hotel. My brother and I asked our parents what was wrong and why we weren't at home, even though the two of us already knew why. Our parents, being parents, lied and said it was because there was a spider infestation. This made me feel bad. But when I looked at my dad, I knew there was something more. A couple of spiders wouldn't force you out of your home. No, my dad had seen something worse, something that made him scared for his family's lives. I knew then for sure that he'd seen it. We moved in with my mom's parents, our grandparents, until we were able to sell the house and move to a new place. Brandon didn't have to sleep in that room anymore. Later on in life, after I'd moved out, I came back from time to time, as grown kids do, to visit his parents. And on one occasion, I just had to know. So I asked my dad, "Why did you wake us up in the middle of the night and move us away from that house? I thought you loved it." He leaned forward, and before he could say anything, I told him, "And don't you tell me spiders. I know it wasn't just because spiders." With that, he seemed to have decided against saying anything. So I pressed him further. "Dad, you saw it too. At the window. That thing that looked like a dog, but it was on two legs and tried to get in through the window." His eyes went wide. So did my mom's. So I'm assuming way back when, my dad had told my mom, if my mom hadn't seen it herself. "How did you know about that?" he asked. "Dad, Brandon had been seeing it the entire time. Why do you think he changed so suddenly?" His expression surrendered to one of guilt. "Oh no, that's what I was afraid of. Believe you me, I put one and two together." He rubbed his mouth with his hand and shook his head. "I'm so glad I moved us out of there right away. Wish I'd done it sooner." With that, I had confirmation that what we saw was real, and that our little Home Alone-style plan to get my dad to see it too had worked. I told my dad not to feel bad about it, but I think we're all scarred for life after living in that house. And to think, if I'd never switched rooms with Brandon, what could have happened to him? The Adirondack, from Tomcaters. If you ever spend your time up at the Adirondack Mountains, then be careful of what lurks around Mount Gore. The mountains are beautiful. It's like an entirely new world compared to the busy and loud city life. So when my great aunt gave me an opportunity to spend time with her, my great uncle, and second cousin, I think it's my second cousin, I don't know how family stuff works, at the Adirondack Mountains in upstate New York, I quickly said yes. The months came and went, and soon it was time for me to head to where they lived, flying out to the mountains. We finally arrived at a condo complex called The Summit. It was near a small town called North Creek and overlooked Mount Gore, which was famous for skiing. Well, it used to be. The towns up here are slowly dying out, and all you could see were for sale signs everywhere. I think that's because the town used to thrive upon the logging industry back in the 1800s. Anyway, we went out to a restaurant that had an outstanding view of Lake George. All the boats and parasailing, the calm waters in the mountains creating a valley, and all that centering around this lake. As we were looking at the menu, I glanced over at a painting on the wall. It seemed to be an extremely old painting. If I had to guess, I'd say 17 or 1800s. In the painting, there were people lying on the ground. I assumed they were dead. There was a child running towards a house with a woman in it, and an odd-looking person on all fours, from the looks of it. The painting intrigued me, but it was just a painting after all, right? Night 1. After a fun day, we arrived back at the condo. The place was still as we left it. Luggage everywhere and a fridge full of food. I spent a few hours watching TV and scrolling through Twitter to see what pointless arguments are being made by people. It was about 9 p.m. by then, and I had the windows open to see the stars. But unfortunately, it was overcast. Still, the area was a sight to see. Everyone else was asleep upstairs, leaving me in the dark living room with only the TV and streetlights illuminating the atmosphere. That night, I saw something. I was zoned in on the TV, and I didn't notice what was outside at first, not until it stepped into the light. Across the small street was another condo next to a large forest. In my peripheral vision, I saw a large dark mass step out of the tree line. I look over to see what it was as it slowly made its way to the edge of the light. I dropped my phone onto the carpet floor as I see what the figure is. The creature was at least 7 feet tall and bipedal. It had a body similar to a bodybuilder, but the head reminded me of a German shepherd, just much bigger. It was covered in thick dark gray fur with a somewhat long tail. It made its way to the condo across from ours and sniffed around. From what I knew, there was nobody in that condo. I waited for it to completely turn around so I could close the curtains. But I did keep the curtains cracked enough to make sure this thing didn't come towards our condo. It investigated the other condo but ultimately lost interest. Then it went down on all fours, which must have been a height of about 4 feet, and ran off at a jaw-dropping speed. Shaking, I closed the curtains and quickly went upstairs. I don't know how, but eventually I went to sleep. Morning came and I tried my best to forget about the event, and somehow I was able to. We spent 10 days there total, and my first night gave me a bad first impression of the place. But as more uneventful nights passed, the more forgettable the event got. Until the last night. Night 9. The day had been very fun. We went back to Lake George and went on a steamboat. We went around the lake, seeing more pretty views. When we got back to the condo, I went upstairs in my room to wind down. My room faces away from the mountain, towards heavy forest. I was on my phone watching YouTube. The battery was low, so I plugged it into the charger. Then I set it on my bedside table. Usually I left the windows open to breathe the natural air and to listen to the sounds of the night. Except that night, there was no sound outside. It was already hard for me to sleep to silence, because I was used to the hustle and bustle of zooming cars, planes, dogs barking and whatnot. This startled me, because from what I had heard, if the wildlife goes quiet, a predator is about. From there, I began to keen in on every little noise. There were branches cracking, leaves cracking under something large. Then I hear a thud on the forest floor. The sound was far, but further sounds were getting closer by the second. I sat up in bed to look out at the dark forest in front of me. I wanted to see if a bear or something was coming. But no, it wasn't a bear at all. Instead, I see an abnormally large dog, peeking its head out from behind a tree. It was a couple of feet off the ground and about 30 meters away. The dog or wolf was faced away from me as it sniffed the air. Its sharp ear perked up and quickly faced towards me. The eyes had a yellow glow to them. I was confused because there was no light within the area for them to reflect that way. As we stared each other down, I started to get bad vibes. I lowered my head out of sight to perhaps give the sign that I wasn't interested. Moments passed, and I hear leaves crunching again, coming towards me. I huffed in frustration and looked outside again. That creature was now about 20 meters away, and the eyes were now 7 to 8 feet off the ground. I could see part of its upper torso and its arm that was now wrapped around the tree. It had a hand that resembled that of a person, but it was gray, hairy, and had sharp fingernails. It gave out a snarl as it exposed its teeth. They were like your typical canine teeth, but longer and sharper. I quickly hit the floor, starting to shake as tears filled my eyes. I looked towards a mirror that reflected a good bit of the tree line. I could see human-like feet stepping into frame, and legs with backward bending joints, followed by the lower and upper torso. Then it was fully in view. I watched it scanning our condo for a minute, the longest minute of my life. It reached out to a tree to prop itself up. I was trying my best not to breathe loudly as I cried, but at one point, I accidentally gasped out loud. Fearfully, I looked at the mirror, a decision I regret to this day. It was looking right at the mirror, right at me, with a huge grin on its face. It walked over to the porch and began to pace around. I felt each step as it tried to find a way in. Thank God I locked the door. Minutes passed, and it lost interest, walking back into the woods, but it didn't forget to glance a smile at me just before leaving. Throughout the restless night, all I could hear were howls and the cries of unlucky animals. Sunlight broke, and I ran downstairs to get breakfast ready for everyone before we packed up and left. 2 hours later, we all ate and got packed up. My cousin got his keys and some luggage as he was making his way to the door. All the blood drained out of my face, and my heart sped up as I heard him say, "Hey, who left the door unlocked?" Midwestern werewolf sighting from Direlavender. I grew up in the American Midwest, in a small town surrounded by fields that only those who grew up in this area ever seemed to know even existed. I was in both drama club and academic bowl, so I considered myself lucky that the teacher in charge of the drama club would hold play practice after we got back from academic meets. It was late when drama club got out the night this happened. The play was at the end of the week, and we wanted everything to go off without a hitch, so we stayed a bit later than normal to ensure we had everything perfect. I lived about 15 miles outside of town, and since I didn't drive yet, I often got a ride home from an upperclassman, Kelsey, who lived about a mile or two up the road from me. It was a beautiful night, a few clouds to obscure the view of the night sky, and the moon was nearly full, painting the passing countryside in its pale glow. We had just gotten onto the gravel road, which meant we were halfway to my house, when something large and white darted by my window. I bolted upright in my seat and looked around. Kelsey, noticing my odd behavior, asked, "Ann, what's up?" Looking out the windshield, which was the direction the blur went, I said, "I just saw something huge dart by the window." I gestured to the passenger side window. "It was probably just an owl," Kelsey said, rolling her eyes. "Yeah, sure, an owl." I knew what I saw was way bigger than any bird that would be found around here, but not wanting to sound like I was out of my mind, I kept my mouth shut, all while looking for any trace of what I saw. Kelsey's scream pulled me from my thoughts, and as I turned to her to ask what was wrong, I saw it again, a flash of gray and white darting from behind us. I looked forward, and there, a short distance ahead of us, was a huge wolf. Kelsey slammed on the brakes, but there wasn't enough space between it and us. We were going to hit it. Then, to our horror, it stood up on its hind paws. It reached out with its front paws and grabbed the cattle guard on the front of the Jeep. It skidded back a foot or so before the vehicle came to a stop. I was frozen in place in complete shock at what I was seeing. Where there should have been paws on the creature were hands. Hands with claws, and its chest was just too wide to be that of a normal wolf. It looked from Kelsey to me, and I swear I saw it smile. It let go of the cattle guard, leaving scratches in its wake, and walked around the Jeep, sniffing around the vehicle, all on its back paws, arms swaying slightly, like a person's would as they walk. It stopped once at the back of the vehicle, and again once it reached my side. It looked in the window at us, then jumped. We heard it land momentarily on top of the Jeep, then on the driver's side, and it took off towards town. Kelsey and I looked at each other in complete shock. "Kelsey, please tell me you saw what I saw." I knew she saw it too. I just needed to hear it to prove to myself it had actually happened. "If you mean the freaking werewolf, no, it wasn't just you." With that, we finished the drive to my house and agreed to keep it to ourselves, as no one would have believed us anyway. But over the years, I've gotten the courage to tell people. So be careful. You never know when you may run into a creature that we're taught should only exist in fiction.